The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Council was the most important room in the known galaxy. It sat inside a space station so large that it had its own weather systems on the lower decks. The walls were made of a dark crystal that absorbed light and gave it back slowly, like the station was always breathing. 47 species had seats in that room. Their flags, symbols, and colors covered every surface. The air inside was filtered to suit all of them at once, a mix of gases and pressures that no single species found fully comfortable, but all of them could survive. That was the Council's way. Nobody was fully comfortable. Nobody was supposed to be. Ambassador Yara Ose Mensa walked into the assembly chamber the same way she had walked into it 11 times before. Straight back, slow steps, eyes forward. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and dark brown skin, and she had spent 30 years of her life inside this station. She knew every corridor, every shortcut, every face. She knew which delegates would meet her eyes and which ones would look away. She had learned, after the third petition, to stop expecting warmth. She took her place at the associate member's stand. It was set lower than the full member seats, a fact that had been explained to her, once, as a matter of acoustic engineering. She had never believed that explanation. She stood at the podium, adjusted the translation mic, and began to read. The petition was long. It had taken a team of 40 lawyers, diplomats, and historians 2 years to write. It laid out, in careful and patient detail, every contribution humanity had made to the Council over 80 years. The trade routes humans had opened, the medical technologies they had shared freely, the 43 separate diplomatic conflicts they had helped resolve, quietly, without asking for anything in return. The petition listed all of it, every number, every name, every year. She read for 22 minutes. When she finished, the chamber was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then the session moderator, a Vreth delegate named Councillor Greth Saw, made a small gesture with one of his upper limbs. The gesture meant, in Vreth body language, something close to how tedious. The translation system did not pick it up. Yara did. Greth Saw spoke in his own language, and the translation came through her earpiece a half-second later. He said that the petition raised interesting points, but that the Council felt it was not yet the appropriate time to revisit the question of full membership for the human species. He said that the matter would be referred, once again, to the Membership Review Committee, where it would be studied carefully and returned to the floor when conditions were deemed suitable. The Membership Review Committee had not produced a report in 11 years. There was no vote. There was no debate. There were no questions. The session moderator moved to the next item on the agenda, which was a trade tariff dispute between two species whose names Yara could not pronounce without practice. She picked up her papers. She walked out. In the corridor outside the chamber, she passed 3 other delegates. A tall, pale blue Sul Arak, who moved aside without looking at her. 2 Ithrani, ancient and slow, who watched her with their wide amber eyes but said nothing. And Greth Saw himself, who was speaking to an aide and who paused just long enough to let his secondary eyes drift toward her with an expression she had seen many times before. It was not hatred. It was not even dislike. It was the look a person gives a piece of furniture that has been left in the wrong room for too long. She took the transit pod back to the human diplomatic quarters. She sat down at her desk. She opened her personal communicator and made a single call to Earth. The person on the other end was the Secretary General of the Terran Parliament. He was an old man, and he looked tired. He already knew. He had been watching the feed. "How did the room feel?" he asked. "The same as always," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then I think we already know what happens next." She didn't argue. She had stopped arguing 2 petitions ago. On Earth, the Terran Parliament was in session. The building was in Nairobi, a city of towers and gardens and fast-moving river traffic. The Parliament chamber was full, which was unusual for a Thursday. Every seat was taken. The galleries above were packed with observers who had come in person or sent legal proxies. There were no press feeds allowed inside. That had been decided 3 days earlier, quietly, by a vote that itself had not been publicized. The Secretary General stood at the floor podium and said very few words. He explained that the 12th petition had been tabled, as expected. He said that the Council's Membership Review Committee would receive the petition as it had received the previous 11, and that the committee would study it as it had studied the previous 11, and that nothing would come of it, as nothing had come of the previous 11. Then he said, "I am placing Resolution 1 before this body." There was no noise. People had been expecting this. Some of them had been expecting it for 20 years. Resolution 1 was not a new document. It had been written in draft form for a long time, updated quietly, kept in a sealed archive, waiting for a day that most people had hoped would never come. The vote took 9 minutes. The final count was 412 in favor, 0 against, and 11 abstentions. The abstentions were mostly older members who could not bring themselves to vote yes, but who understood there was no longer a reason to vote no. Resolution 1. The Withdrawal Act passed into law. On Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, inside a shipyard that was officially listed in Council trade records as a civilian heavy transport facility, a man named Chief Engineer Dae-Jung Park received a short message on his encrypted terminal. The message contained 3 words: "Finish the work." He read it twice. Then he put down his coffee, stood up, and walked out onto the main gantry floor. Around him, the shipyard was enormous, a cave carved into Titan's crust, and expanded over 40 years into something the size of a small city. The lights were high, and cold, and blue. The workers moved between machines and scaffolding with the steady rhythm of people who had been doing the same thing for a long time. In the center of the floor, held in a magnetic cradle the size of a football stadium, was a ship. It was not like any ship in the Council's records. It was not built for speed or cargo or combat in the way the Council understood any of those things. It had taken 15 years to reach this point. It had consumed more resources than any single project in human history. And it had been built from the first bolt to the final system, entirely in secret. Park stood on the gantry and looked at it for a long time. He had spent 12 of those 15 years here. He knew every part of it. He had argued about every system, stayed awake over every calculation, buried 4 colleagues who had died before they could see it finished. Now there was a reason to finish it. He turned to his lead engineer, a young woman named Sio, who had been born on Titan and had never once been to Earth. "Full crew to their stations," he said quietly. "No more delays. We have about 72 hours. She didn't ask what happened in 72 hours. She already knew. Back at the Grand Assembly, the session continued without interruption. The trade tariff dispute was resolved. A new infrastructure project was approved. A welcoming ceremony was scheduled for a newly contacted species from the Outer Rim. The agenda moved forward, item by item, the way it always had. Nobody noticed that the human diplomatic quarters had gone dark. Nobody noticed for 3 full hours. By then, the packing had already begun. The first thing the Council noticed was the silence. Not a sudden silence. Not the kind that hits you like a door slamming. It was the slow kind. The kind you notice only after it has already been going on for a while. Like realizing, sometime in the middle of the night, that the rain stopped hours ago. It started with the human trade relay stations. There were 41 of them spread across Council space. Small, automated platforms that bounced signals and tracked cargo and kept the shipping lanes running smoothly. One by one. Over the first 12 hours after the Withdrawal Act passed, they stopped broadcasting. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Simply switched off, in order, from the outer edges of human-controlled space inward, like someone walking through a house and turning off the lights as they left each room. The Council's logistics office flagged it as a technical fault and sent a standard maintenance request to the human diplomatic station. No one answered. The logistics officer, a Sul Arak named Ven Karath, sent a second request, then a third. She checked the diplomatic roster and found that the human ambassador's office had been locked and sealed. She checked the residential corridors assigned to human staff. Empty. She checked the Council's internal movement records and found that in the past 14 hours, every human staff member on the station had taken transit pods to the docking rings and departed on ships that listed their destination as personal travel. No filing required under Article 7 of the Associate Member Charter. Article 7 had not been used in recorded history. Venkarath wrote a report and sent it to her supervisor. Her supervisor sent it up the chain. By the time it reached someone important enough to act on it, 31 hours had passed. Councillor Greth Saw received the intelligence briefing in his private office, which smelled of minerals and was kept 15 degrees cooler than the rest of the station. He read the report once, set it aside, and called his senior aide. "This is a reaction," he said. "They are upset about the petition. They want attention." His aide, who was younger and had spent more time actually reading human history, said carefully, "Counselor, the withdrawal is legally filed. Under the Associate Charter, once filed, it cannot be." "I know what the Charter says," Grethsaw said. "I also know that humans have made dramatic gestures before and pulled back. They are an emotional species. Give it a week." His aide did not argue. He had learned that arguing with Grethsaw required energy he did not always have. But after he left the office, he pulled up the intelligence files himself and read them more carefully. The human staff departures were not dramatic. There were no speeches, no protests, no public statements. Human diplomatic personnel had left their posts the way an office worker leaves on their last day desk, cleared, equipment returned, door closed behind them. The reports from council border stations described human ships moving through checkpoints with their paperwork in perfect order, their crews polite and quiet, their manifests completely clean. That was the part that bothered him. Not the leaving, the tidiness of it. The Ythrani elder, whose name translated roughly as Keeper of the Long View, did not need an intelligence briefing. She had been watching humanity for 40 years. She had voted in favor of their membership petition every single time. She had been outvoted every single time. Now she sat in the small garden attached to her quarters. The council station had several biodomes, and the Ythrani one was full of low light and slow-moving air, and she reviewed a different set of files. Not diplomatic reports. Not logistics data. Scientific papers. Human scientific papers. Published openly over the past 30 years in the council's shared academic databases. She had always found them interesting. Other council species found them difficult to read because humans had a habit of burying their most important conclusions in the middle of a paper rather than at the beginning, and their notation systems were non-standard, and they used metaphor in technical writing in a way that made translation systems produce strange results. She had learned to read past all of that. She was reading past all of that now, and what she was seeing made her very still. She sent a message to the council's chief science director, a Vreth academic who had won 17 awards, and who responded to her message 6 hours later with a polite note explaining that he was busy and would review her concerns when time permitted. She stared at his response for a long moment. Then she went back to reading. On Titan, the work had not stopped since the message arrived. Chief Engineer Park had not slept in 30 hours. He did not feel tired. There was a specific kind of energy that came from knowing you were at the end of something. A focused, clear, almost cold feeling, like the air before a storm. He moved through the shipyard with it, checking systems, approving final tests, signing off on reports that would never be sent to anyone outside this facility. The Threshold, that was the ship's name, though it had no official registration in any council database, was almost ready. Its power core had been running in test cycles for the past 20 hours and had not produced a single anomalous reading. The navigation system had been calibrated and recalibrated so many times that the lead navigator, a man named Riku who had been on this project for 9 years, could recite the figures in his sleep. There were 7 more ships in Jupiter orbit. They were older than the Threshold, smaller, and built on a different design. They had been constructed over a period of 20 years under various cover projects and listed in council trade records under descriptions that were technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. The council's intelligence services had looked at the Jupiter orbital installations twice in the past decade. Both times, they had seen exactly what the documentation told them to expect: large-scale industrial platforms, heavy manufacturing, resource processing, standard infrastructure for a species at humanity's stage of development. They had not looked closely enough. They had never had a reason to. 48 hours after the Withdrawal Act passed, the Council held an emergency session. It was not listed as an emergency session on the public agenda. It was listed as a routine procedural review, which was a category that most delegates didn't bother attending. Grethsaw had arranged it that way, deliberately. He did not want to give the appearance that the Council was rattled. The room was less than half full. Grethsaw spoke first. He said that the human withdrawal, while unexpected in its timing, was not cause for concern. He said that the Council had managed its affairs for 4,000 years without human participation, and would continue to do so. He said that when humanity's frustration passed, and it would pass, the door would remain open for a renewed associate application. He made it sound generous. The Sul Arak delegate, a heavy-set creature named Vorath who communicated primarily through color shifts in his outer membrane, flickered briefly toward yellow-orange, which in Sul Arak color language indicated something between skepticism and you are not telling the whole truth. He said nothing out loud, but several delegates who could read Sul Arak coloring noticed. One delegate who noticed was a young Yithrani junior diplomat. She had just come from a meeting with the Keeper of the Long View, her great-grandmother, and she was carrying a data chip that she had been told to guard carefully. She sat in the back of the chamber and listened to Grethsaw speak, and thought about the papers she had spent the last 3 hours reading. She raised her hand to speak. She was not called upon. At hour 71, a Council deep space monitoring station at the edge of the Sol system sent an automated alert. The alert flagged an unusual energy buildup in the vicinity of Jupiter. The readings did not match any known power source in the Council's scientific database. The monitoring station's AI flagged it as unclassified phenomenon review recommended and forwarded it to the appropriate department. The appropriate department's review queue was 4 days long. 1 hour later, the Withdrawal Act's 72-hour notice window closed. Humanity's associate membership in the Galactic Council ended at exactly the moment the charter required. On the Council station, in the human diplomatic quarters, the lights were still on set to automatic, running on a timer. The rooms were clean. The furniture was in place. The data terminals were wiped, but still powered. Everything was in order. In the docking rings, the last human vessel had departed 11 hours ago. Nobody had watched it leave. It had not asked for a departure announcement. It had filed its paperwork, cleared the checkpoint, and gone. The galaxy was about to find out where. The signal came through on every open frequency at once. It did not use words. It did not need to. It was a broadcast position marker, the kind that ships use when they want every nearby receiver to know exactly where they are. Every Council monitoring station within 40 light-years picked it up simultaneously. The computers that processed it flagged it immediately, not because the signal was unusual in format, but because of where it was coming from. Jupiter orbit. 8 sources. Broadcasting together. The Council's nearest monitoring station was a small, unmanned platform sitting at the edge of the Sol system's outer boundary. Its sensors turned automatically toward Jupiter and began to record. What they saw was transmitted back to the Grand Assembly Station in a compressed data package that arrived at 0300 hours station time, while most of the Council's delegates were in their rest cycles. The duty officer who received it was a young Vreth technician on his second posting. He opened the file, looked at the sensor readings, looked at them again, and then quietly sent an emergency wake-up call to every senior Council official on the station. He did not write a subject line. He did not need one. Anyone who looked at the numbers would understand. By 0400, the Council's main observation deck was crowded. The 8 ships in Jupiter orbit were not moving. They were simply sitting there, in a loose formation, and broadcasting their position. Each one was powered up. Each one was producing energy readings that made the Council's instruments behave strangely, not because the instruments were broken, but because they had never been asked to measure anything like this before. The numbers kept revising themselves as the monitoring station's AI tried to find the right scale for what it was detecting. Grethsaw stood at the front of the observation deck and looked at the display screen with his 4 eyes, 2 of which were wider than usual. He said nothing for almost a full minute, which was unusual for him. "What are we looking at?" he finally asked. The council's chief science director, who had been woken up in a hurry and was still pulling his outer coat straight, looked at the readouts and said, with the particular tone of a person whose confidence has been shaken but who is not yet willing to admit it, "The power signatures are consistent with a form of spatial manipulation theory. It is a theoretical framework. It has been discussed in academic literature for some time. The mathematics suggest it is possible, but the energy requirements to make it practical are—" He stopped. He looked at the numbers again. "Were," he corrected quietly, "were considered prohibitive." "And now?" Grethsaw asked. The science director did not answer right away. The Ythrani elder, the keeper of the long view, stood near the back of the group. She had not been surprised by the wake-up call. She had been awake already. She watched the screen and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because she had learned a long time ago that saying, "I told you" to people who had not listened was a waste of the time you had left. At 0512 station time, Ambassador Yara Ose-Mensah sent a final transmission to the Grand Assembly. She was not on the council station. The signal came from a location that the monitoring computers identified as somewhere in the inner Sol system, but the exact point could not be pinned down. The transmission was clear and clean, in standard council trade language, which humanity had always used for official communications, even though it was not their first language, or their second, or their 100th. The message was not long. She said, "For 80 years, we asked to be part of this council. We asked to be recognized as equals. We asked for a seat at a table where decisions were made that affected our species. We were told, each time, that the moment was not right, that we needed more time, that patience was a virtue, and that the council would find the right occasion when the occasion came." She paused. "We have been patient. We have waited. We have contributed. We have helped. And we have watched the occasion be moved, year after year, to a future that was never allowed to arrive." Another pause. On the observation deck, no one moved. "You spent 80 years asking whether humanity was ready for the galaxy. We spent the same 80 years asking ourselves the same question. We now have our answer. We are sorry that yours came too late to matter." The transmission ended. On the display screen, the 8 ships began to power up fully. The energy readings climbed beyond the top of the instrument's previous scale. The monitoring station's AI created a new scale in real time and kept going. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The ships did not fire engines. There was no thrust, no exhaust, no debris. What happened instead was something that the Council's best scientists would spend the next 3 years trying to describe accurately, and would ultimately settle on a word borrowed from human mathematics: folding. Space itself, around each of the 8 vessels, appeared to change. It was not visible to the naked eye in any traditional sense. The monitoring station's optical sensors picked up a distortion, like looking at something through very hot air, except that the distortion was not in the air. It was in the space itself, in the geometry of the distance between where the ships were and where everything else was. The reading suggested that the ships were not accelerating. They were not traveling through space at all. They were moving space around themselves. The process took 4 minutes and 11 seconds, from full power activation to completion. Then the ships were gone. Not destroyed, not damaged. Gone. The monitoring station swept the entire Sol system in an automated sensor pass that took 20 seconds. No wreckage. No energy residue matching the ship's signatures. No distress signals. No trace. 8 ships. Gone. The observation deck was completely silent. Grethsaw sat down in a chair that was not meant for sitting in, because his legs had stopped being willing to hold him up. He was not a dramatic creature by nature. He processed things slowly and carefully, and usually in private. But he sat in that chair and looked at the empty display screen, the Sol system, showing nothing unusual now, just planets in their orbits, moons going about their business, the sun burning the same way it always had. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt small. In the hours that followed, the Council's scientific community woke up fast. Meetings were called. Papers were pulled from archives. The human scientific publications that the Ythrani elder had been reading for 3 days were suddenly being downloaded by every researcher on the station. They were difficult papers. They used unusual notation. They buried their conclusions in the middle sections. Researchers who had ignored them for years, or skimmed them, or filed them under interesting but impractical, were now reading them with the specific focus of people who need to understand something quickly and are afraid of what they are going to find. What they found was not comforting. The papers were not new. Some of them were 15 years old, 20. A few traced back further. They were written quietly, without fanfare, published in standard databases, available to anyone who wanted to read them. Nobody important had wanted to read them because they came from a species that was not a full member, and whose science, while occasionally clever, was generally considered derivative of council mainstream research. Except it wasn't. It had not been, for a long time. The chief science director locked himself in his office at 0900 hours and did not come out until late afternoon. When he did, his outer coat was wrinkled, and he had the look of a person who has been doing arithmetic and keeps getting the same answer, no matter how many times they redo it. He went directly to the Ythrani elder's quarters and knocked on the door. She opened it and looked at him without surprise. "How long?" he asked. Just those 2 words. She considered for a moment. The earliest papers that point in this direction. About 22 years ago. But the framework, the real framework, was probably in place 30 years back, at minimum. They just did not publish the whole picture at once. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't we see it?" She answered him honestly, because she respected him enough for that. "Because you were not looking," she said. "And because they did not ask you to." He nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say. He went back to his office. The light in his window stayed on all night. On Earth, in the cities and stations and habitats and ships that still carried human beings going about their daily lives, most people did not see the departure of the 8 ships. It was not broadcast publicly. There were no crowds watching, no speeches, no ceremonies. The Parliament had decided against any of that. There had been enough ceremony, enough talking, enough waiting for recognition that was never going to come. Most people found out from a short message that appeared on public networks at 0600 Earth time, in every language, in plain and simple words. It said, "We are leaving, not in anger, not in bitterness. We have simply decided to find out what we can do on our own. We wish the Council, and all its species, no harm. We hope, one day, they will understand." It was signed by the Secretary General. Below his name were the names of every member of Parliament who had voted for the Withdrawal Act. All 412 of them. The message was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The work spoke for itself. The first conflict broke out 19 days after the departure. It was a border dispute between the Vreth outer colonies and a small species called the Then Ori, who lived on 3 moons at the edge of Vreth territory. The dispute was not new. It had been going on, in various forms, for about 30 years. Lines on maps, resource claims, old grievances about who had been on which moon first and who had arrived later and decided to stay. For most of those 30 years, the conflict had never become a shooting war. There had been tense moments. There had been fleets moving into position. There had been speeches and counter-speeches and emergency council sessions where both sides stated their positions loudly and then went home. And in between all of that, quietly, a human diplomatic team had always been there. They had not been official mediators. The council had never given them that title, because that would have required acknowledging them as full members with standing to operate in that capacity. They were listed, in the official records, as trade liaison consultants, which was a designation that technically gave them no authority at all. But over many years, the same 3 or 4 human diplomats had been rotating through that region, talking to both sides, finding the small agreements that kept the large disagreements from becoming something worse. Nobody had asked them to do this. It was not in any treaty. It was not funded by the council. It was simply something they did because someone needed to do it, and because they were good at it, and because they had apparently decided that the absence of a title was not a reason to stop. Now they were gone. And 19 days later, a Thenori supply station was destroyed by what the Vreth government officially called a navigational accident, and what the Thenori government officially called an act of war. The council convened an emergency session. Both sides shouted. A ceasefire resolution was passed. The ceasefire held for 8 days before another incident occurred. A senior council mediator, a Sul Iraq named Vorath, who had many years of experience, was assigned to the region. He arrived, held his first meeting with the Vreth delegation, and came away with pages of notes and a strong sense that he was missing something. Not facts, not positions. Something harder to name: a tone, a texture, an understanding of how these particular two sides actually talk to each other below the formal language, what they were really afraid of, where the small openings were that could eventually lead to a larger piece. He sent a request to the council archive for any records of the human liaison team's activities in the region. The archive returned 11 years of files, handwritten notes, meeting summaries, private correspondence, maps with handwritten margin notes in at least 4 different human languages, personality profiles of key figures on both sides, built up over years of individual conversations. Vorath read them for 2 days straight, and at the end of it, sat back and stared at the ceiling of his temporary office on the mediation vessel. The files were extraordinary. They were not just diplomatic records. They were a kind of human knowledge, a slow, patient accumulation of understanding about 2 species and their history, written by people who had clearly spent years listening before they said a single useful word. There was a note in one of the files, written by a human diplomat named Carmen Reyes, that said simply, "The Vreth commander talks about his father a lot. His father was at the first border incident. Find out more about that before the next session." Vorath did not know if the Vreth commander still talked about his father. He did not know who to ask. Carmen Reyes was no longer available. He closed the files and went back to work with what he had. The conflict dragged on for months. The second thing that fell apart was the medical supply chain. Across council space, there were approximately 230 facilities where human pharmaceutical products, or medical technologies, were in active use, not as the primary systems, but as supplements, backups, alternatives. Humans had a particular skill in what they called adaptive medicine, the practice of solving health problems in resource-limited environments with improvised or minimal equipment. It was not glamorous science. The Council's major medical institutions did not teach it. It was, in the academic hierarchy of galactic medicine, the rough equivalent of knowing how to fix a machine with tape and wire when the proper tools were not available. But tape and wire, it turned out, were in use in a great many places. As human contracts expired and human medical personnel departed, gaps appeared. Small facilities on remote colony worlds that had relied on human-trained practitioners found themselves short of staff with specific skills. A technique for treating respiratory distress in low-oxygen environments, developed by a human researcher named Dr. Asha Mwangi and used widely in Outer Rim settlements, turned out to exist only in human medical training programs. The Council's medical board spent 4 months trying to reconstruct it from published papers before realizing that the published papers did not include the practical elements the judgment calls, the real-world adjustments that came from training alongside someone who had actually used it under difficult conditions. Dr. Mwangi herself was unreachable. Every attempt to contact humans through their remaining relay infrastructure received the same automated response. The system was active, and messages were accepted, but no reply was guaranteed, and no timeline could be provided. The Council's medical board filed a formal request through diplomatic channels, asking humans to provide training materials for the technique. The request was acknowledged automatically. A response was promised within a standard processing window. 3 months later, the response had not arrived. The third thing, and this one was harder to measure, harder to put in a report, was that the Council itself became more difficult to run. It was not obvious at first. The Council had existed for 4,000 years without humanity, and had done fine. Its procedures were established. Its members knew how to interact. Its agenda moved forward. But something was off. A delegate from a small species called the Ren Veth, who had only joined the Council 6 years ago, made a comment during a private meeting that one of the Ythrani junior diplomats found interesting enough to write down. The Renveth delegate said, "When we first joined, there was always a human somewhere in the room. Not always speaking. Sometimes just sitting. And when the session ended, and things had gotten complicated, there would usually be a human in the corridor afterward who would come up and explain, quietly, what had actually happened, and what the different sides actually meant under all the formal language." She paused. Then she said, "I did not realize that was something we relied on until it was not there anymore." The Ythrani diplomat wrote the comment down and sent it to the keeper of the long view, who read it and set it on her desk, next to 11 other similar comments she had collected over the past 2 months. A delegation was eventually sent to Earth. It was not officially a diplomatic delegation. It was framed as a routine relationship maintenance visit, which was a category that had been invented specifically for this purpose, and which everybody understood to mean, we are going to try to talk to the humans without admitting that we need to. The delegation consisted of 5 ships and 12 officials. They traveled to the Sol system and found it exactly as they had left it, inhabited, operational, clearly functioning. The planets were as populated as ever. The orbital stations were busy. Signals moved across the system in normal patterns, but nothing responded to them. They broadcast standard greeting protocols on all frequencies. They sent official communication requests to the Earth government's listed contact channels. They tried the Titan shipyard, the Mars administrative hub, the outer system relay platforms. Everything received their signals. The lights on the relay systems confirmed receipt, but nothing replied. One of the delegation ships moved closer to Earth orbit and attempted a direct visual hail on an optical frequency. Through their sensors, they could see cities, lights, movement. People were down there. Millions of people. Going about their lives. Not one of them answered. The delegation stayed for 9 days. On the 5th day, one of the junior officials, a young Vreth named Keldara, who had studied human culture in his academic training, and who had always found it interesting, sent a personal message rather than an official one. He addressed it to no one in particular and wrote, in the most conversational human trade language he could manage, "I understand if you do not want to talk to us. I am not sure I would want to either. I just want you to know that some of us did not agree with the decisions that were made. I am not sure that changes anything. But I wanted to say it." He did not expect a reply. He got one, 6 hours later. It was a single line, from an address he did not recognize, in English rather than trade language, which meant it was probably written by someone who had decided, personally, to respond rather than following any official policy. It said, "We know. It doesn't change anything. But thank you for saying it." He kept that message for the rest of his life. The delegation returned to the council station and filed a report that carefully documented their findings and their failure, and which recommended, in its final paragraph, that the council consider a formal apology as a potential avenue toward renewed communication. The report was accepted and referred to the Diplomatic Relations Committee. The committee added it to their agenda. The agenda was long. The Ythrani elder gave one speech during this period, at a full assembly session 3 months after the departure. She was old even by Ythrani standards, which was very old indeed, and she stood at the podium without notes and spoke slowly, in her own language, and the translation that came through the earpieces of every delegate in the room was unusually good because the Ythrani Linguistic Archive had worked with human translation scholars for 40 years, and those scholars had made the system significantly better than it had been before, and no one in the room had thought about that fact until now. She said, "We are a council. We have rules and procedures and 4,000 years of history. We are very proud of all of it. And we should ask ourselves, now, in this room, without the comfort of an agenda or a committee or a review process, what did all of that history teach us, and did we use it? A species came to us. They came honestly. They worked hard. They built things we did not notice and solved problems we did not ask them to solve. They asked us, 12 times, to let them sit at this table. We said no. We said wait. We said not yet." She looked around the room. "We did not have a good reason. We had a habit, and we confused the two. She stepped back from the podium and returned to her seat. Nobody applauded. It was not that kind of speech. It was the kind of speech that sits in the room after it is finished and does not leave. Outside the assembly chamber, the station continued its orbit around the neutron star. Somewhere unimaginably far away, in space that no council map had ever marked, something vast and human-built moved through the dark between galaxies and did not look back. The formal apology took 1 year to write, not because the words were difficult. Words, the council had always been good at. It took 1 year because agreeing on the words required agreement from all 47 member species, and 47 species had 47 different ideas about what an apology should contain, how it should be structured, what it should admit, and how much it should ask for in return. There were 17 drafts. There were 3 committee reviews. There was 1 vote that failed, and another that passed narrowly, and a third that had to be held again because a procedural requirement had not been met. In the end, the document that existed was not perfect. Most of the delegates knew that. But it was real, and it was honest in the places that mattered, and it had been signed by every sitting member of the council, including Greth Saw, who had taken a very long time to put his mark on it, and had done so without comment, late on a quiet evening, when the assembly chamber was empty. The document said that the council recognized it had failed humanity, that the decisions to delay and deny full membership had not been based on any legitimate evaluation of humanity's readiness, but on assumption, habit, and the simple comfort of things staying as they were. It said that the council was aware this had caused harm, not dramatic harm, not the kind that came from open violence, but the slower kind that comes from being told, again and again, that you do not yet belong where you have earned the right to stand. It said that the council was sorry. It said it plainly, without qualifications, in the center of the text where it could not be missed. At the end, it extended a formal invitation for humanity to return, in whatever capacity they found acceptable, under terms they themselves would define. It was broadcast on every open frequency the council controlled. It went out in all 47 council languages, and in every human language stored in the translation archive, all 9,212 of them. Some of those languages had been contributed to the archive by human linguists who had worked with council translators as a courtesy, years ago, without being asked and without receiving credit. Nobody had thought about that at the time. The broadcast reached Earth. There was no question about that. The relay infrastructure confirmed receipt. The signal had landed. Somewhere on the planet, or in the orbital stations, or on the colonies scattered across the Sol system, someone had heard it. Nothing came back. The council waited. Standard communication turnaround for a response from Sol was approximately 40 hours, accounting for signal travel and processing time. They waited 40 hours. Then 80. Then 120. Then a week. The automated receipt confirmation from the human relay systems continued to come through on schedule, which meant the infrastructure was still operational, which meant the silence was not technical. It was a choice. Greth Saw, sitting in his office on the station, received the same automated receipt confirmation as everyone else. He looked at it for a long time. He was not the same person who had gestured dismissively at Yara Ose Mensa in the corridor 1 year ago. He was not sure exactly when he had changed, or whether change was even the right word for it. He had simply begun to understand something that he had not understood before, and the understanding had made him quieter than he used to be. He did not write a response to the confirmation. There was no one to write to. He closed the file and went about his work. The probe was Ythrani funded. That detail mattered later, though it was not widely publicized at the time. The keeper of the long view had spent 3 months after the departure, quietly building a case for an exploratory mission. Not a diplomatic mission. Not a retrieval mission. Simply an attempt to find out where humanity had gone. She had argued, in private meetings with 3 other council members who trusted her judgment, that the council had an obligation to understand what it had lost, and that understanding required information, and information required looking. The funding was approved through a science budget allocation that most council members did not read carefully. The probe was fast by council standards, very fast, because Withrani engineering had always been stronger on propulsion than most species gave them credit for. It launched from a station on the outer rim and headed in the direction that the 8 ships had been facing when they disappeared. Extrapolated forward through a year of potential travel, at the speeds the energy readings had suggested were possible, the calculations were not confident. The margin of error was enormous. The probe's AI was instructed to sweep a very wide area and report anything unusual. It traveled for 4 months before it found anything. What it found was not small. At a distance from the Milky Way galaxy that no Council vessel had ever reached, far out in the intergalactic void. In the dark, between one galaxy and the next, the probe's long-range sensors picked up structures. Enormous ones. The probe could not get close enough for detailed imaging without risking detection, so it observed from distance, and what it saw was enough. There were platforms curved and interconnected, spanning distances that the probe's AI had to revise its scale estimates to accommodate. There were energy signatures suggesting power generation on a level that made the Council's largest stations look like camping lights. There was movement ships, or things that functioned like ships, moving between the structures with a regularity that suggested an established and functioning network. The probe sent its data back in a compressed burst. Then it moved closer, very carefully, because its AI had been programmed with a secondary instruction. If you find something, get as much detail as you can before they notice you. They noticed it in about 11 minutes. A single vessel appeared at the edge of the probe's sensor range. It was larger than anything in the Council fleet, and it moved with that same quality that the 8 ships had shown in Jupiter orbit. No thrust signature, no conventional drive output, just movement, the way a thought moves, the way water moves downhill. The vessel did not fire on the probe. It scanned it. The probe's instruments registered the scan clearly, thorough, detailed, covering every system and every bit of stored data. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then the vessel moved on. It did not change course. It did not send a signal. It simply continued wherever it had been going, at a pace that suggested the probe was not a threat, not a priority, and not particularly interesting. The probe held its position and continued recording for another 22 hours before its power reserves required it to begin the long journey back. In that 22 hours, it counted 41 distinct vessels and 7 major structures, and those were only the ones in the area it could see. The structures extended beyond its sensor range in at least 3 directions. Humanity had been gone for less than 14 months. The probe's data arrived at the Council station and was reviewed first by the keeper of the long view, who looked at it carefully and felt something she could not quite name, not pride exactly, not sadness exactly, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as both. She thought about Yara Ose-Mensah standing at the associate members' podium, reading a petition to a room that was not listening. She thought about the petition before that, and the one before that. She submitted the data to the Council's Science Archive and attached a note that said, "For the record." The data was reviewed. It caused, as could be expected, a considerable amount of reaction. Emergency sessions were called. Scientific panels were assembled. There was debate about what the structures meant, what the timeline implied, how the energy outputs were being produced. There was a great deal of discussion. One of the quieter discussions happened in a side room off the main corridor, between the chief science director and a young Vreth researcher named Keldara, who had been the delegate on the Earth visit delegation, and who had received that one-line personal response. Keldara had since transferred to the Council's science department and had spent the past year reading human scientific papers with the kind of dedication that came from personal investment. He told the science director that the structures the probe had found were consistent with the theoretical framework outlined in a series of papers published 26 years ago by a human physicist named Dr. Tanaka Hiroshi, whose work had been noted in the Council's academic database as interesting but speculative and filed accordingly. The science director asked when the papers had been published. 26 years ago, Keldara said again. The science director was quiet for a moment. Then he asked whether there were more papers. Papers after those. A continuation. Keldara said yes. There were many more. There was a whole body of work, built up over decades, published openly in the shared databases, available to anyone who wanted to read it. Did anyone read them? The science director asked. He already knew the answer. He was asking it out loud because he felt that the answer deserved to be said out loud at least once. In a real room. By a real person. No, Keldara said. Not really. Not seriously. Not until now. The last significant thing that happened in this period was small. Almost no one knew about it. In the Council Station's diplomatic archive, there was an old file server that stored incoming communications going back many decades. Most of it was routine trade requests, status updates, standard interagency correspondence. The archive was managed by an automated system that sorted, labeled, and stored everything according to its filing date and sender classification. In the section labeled Associate Member, Human Incoming Personal, filed under the date of the night before the final vote on the 12th petition, there was a message. It had been sent by Ambassador Yara Ose Mensa to the Council's general diplomatic inbox. Not to any specific person. To the inbox. The kind of message a person sends when they want to be heard, but no longer believe anyone is listening, but send it anyway. Because not sending it would mean giving up on something entirely. The message had been received, automatically confirmed, automatically sorted, and automatically filed. It had never been read. A junior Yuthrani archivist named Selah, great-granddaughter of the Keeper of the Long View, who had been assigned to review old correspondence files as part of a new project, found it while running a routine sort. She opened it because the filing date was one day before the Withdrawal Act vote, and she had been told to flag anything from that period as potentially significant. She read it. She sat very still for a while. Then she actually printed it, on physical material, the old way, and carried it to her great-grandmother's quarters and knocked on the door. The Keeper of the Long View opened the door, looked at her great-granddaughter's face, and knew without asking that whatever was in that paper was not good news. She read it standing in the doorway. The message said, "I don't know who will read this. Maybe no one. I have spent 30 years here. I have believed, for most of that time, that if we kept asking, if we kept working, if we kept showing up, something would change. I still believe that people can change. I am less sure about institutions. We are going to file the withdrawal tomorrow if the vote fails. I think the vote will fail. I have thought that every time, and been right every time. I want whoever reads this to know that we did not want to leave. We wanted to belong here. We wanted to build something with you. We were ready to do that. We are good at that. You never gave us the chance to show you. There is still time. But only just. Yi Ose Mensa." The Keeper of the Long View read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, held it in both hands for a moment, and looked out at the stars through the small window in her quarters. Somewhere out there, in the dark beyond the edge of the galaxy, the answer to that message was already a year old and moving further away with every passing second, not in anger, not in bitterness. Simply moving forward, the way things do when they have waited long enough and finally decided to stop waiting. She handed the paper back to her great-granddaughter. "File it," she said quietly. Under "too late to fix it," Selah took the paper and looked at her great-grandmother's face and understood, for the first time, what it truly meant to be old in a galaxy that moved slowly and learned even more slowly, and to watch a door close that had been open for a very long time. She went back to her desk and filed the message. The stars continued their long, quiet burning, the same as they always had, knowing nothing and caring nothing about the things that passed between them, the ships and the words, and the chances that came once and did not come again.